There's a story I've been wanting to tell for a while now that happened to me some years ago. Thinking back, it gives me the chills. For the sake of anonymity for those involved, I've changed our names, but the dates are accurate. For clarity's sake, I'm not a believer in the paranormal, or the supernatural, or any myths and legends. I'm still not sold on what happened, but it's creepy enough when I consider all the facts. I do apologize for the length, but I want to get this all out in one fell swoop. You see, my cousins live back in northern Wisconsin, the rural part, where houses are surrounded by miles of woods and the roads are dirt and gravel. Not that they're out in the boonies or anything. The main town, though small, is only about 5 miles down the highway from where they live. My uncle, let's call him Kurt, he's the local sheriff of the area, and so he has lots of interesting stories to tell. My cousins, having grown up in these woods, are expert hunters and fishermen. They've hunted at all hours of the day, in all kinds of weather, and have tracked anything from deer and pheasants to bears. What I'm trying to say is, they don't scare easy. Neither do their hunting dogs, 2 black Labradors named Magic and DJ. I've never been easy to scare either, nor has my brother, but what we experienced was enough to give us all the heebie-jeebies. Even 10 years later, remembering these events is enough to give me the chills. There had been strange occurrences over the years, none of which my brother nor I were aware of until we visited them one summer, back in 2006. Now, my mom, my brother, and I usually visited them for at least a week or 2 every year up until Rob, who was 3 years older than my brother, left for college. We never experienced anything out of the ordinary until that year, and haven't experienced anything since. What happened, though, has stayed with us all. My brother Mike and I weren't made aware of these happenings until we'd experienced enough to convince Uncle Kurt to share what he knew. Rob and Sam, who was 1 year older than me and a year younger than Mike, also chipped in with their own experiences. I'm chronicling our tales here, in order, as best as I can remember. 1998. Rob was about 7 years old at this time. One night, he snuck into the backyard to play on the old swing set they had set up. My cousin's backyard is surrounded by an 8-foot-high chain-link fence to keep bears and other predators out and to keep the kids in. After swinging for a few minutes, Rob said he remembered hearing the most horrible noise he's ever heard, like something out of a horror movie. It was a distant roar, like some kind of huge beast, deep and brassy, with an animalistic rumble, but at the same time, screechy, like fingernails on a blackboard. Terrified, Rob fled back inside, screaming for his parents. They, apparently, had slept through the noise and had only awoken when they heard Rob scream. Approximately 2005. Kurt was finishing his patrol one night when he received a call from dispatch. Apparently, a local man had left his home early that morning to go fishing at one of the many lakes around town, promising his wife to be back around lunchtime. When he still hadn't returned by evening, his wife worriedly called the police. Once informed of which lake he had gone to, Kurt and a couple squad cars headed to the narrow dirt trail that led off from the highway. It was a small turnoff, easy to miss if you didn't know it was there, surrounded on both sides by dense foliage and trees. It took maybe 10 minutes to get from the highway to the lake, as you had to drive very slowly on the dirt path to avoid potholes, branches, and occasionally animals that may be in the road. After a few minutes on the trail, the officers came upon the man's car, spun out from the trail, and smashed against a tree several feet into the woods. The entire passenger side was caved in, as if something had rammed into the car at high speed. and shoved it into the tree. There was blood and tufts of hair all over the inside of the car, and the driver's seatbelt was ripped out of the buckle, and the windshield was completely gone. It was as if the man had been wrenched through the windshield and dragged away, but the police couldn't find any trail, even after bringing in canines. The only evidence pointing towards an animal attack rather than a murder was a set of claw marks gouged into the metal hood of the car. Experts determined it must have been a very angry bear, but no bears had been sighted, let alone reported during that season. The man's body never turned up. August 9th, 2006. Sam and Mike, on the second night we were visiting, decided to try out camping in the backyard. Despite the fence, our aunt insisted they take at least one of the dogs into the tent with them, just to be safe. So they took Magic, the older lab. Magic had been very well trained and was usually very quiet, but sometime in the middle of the night she became incredibly agitated. She began barking, quietly at first, but soon much louder. This is when Sam and Mike woke up. They told me that Magic would bark for several seconds, then fall quiet, not even growling, then start barking again. After repeating this several times, the two of them started hearing rustling from somewhere beyond the fence. They were camped somewhat near the house, so whatever was capable of making that much noise had to be huge. They stayed quiet, Sam warning Mike that if it was indeed a bear, any sudden movement may cause it to charge, and that fence wouldn't keep it out for long. However, despite Magic's ferocious barking, the rustling kept getting louder. Just as Sam was about to take his flashlight to try and see anything, our Aunt Kelly opened the side door and bellowed at Magic to shut up. Kelly, despite being a relatively frail woman, was incredibly loud and forceful, to the point that even Magic was somewhat scared of her. Apparently, whatever was in the woods was too, because the rustling soon faded and Magic fell quiet. Neither Sam nor Mike were able to fall asleep again, because a couple hours later the rustling started again. Magic didn't make any more noise, but she stayed on high alert, standing stiff with her tail between her legs, staring at the front of the tent. Sam said the rustling would die down occasionally, but then start up from a different direction, as if whatever was out there was circling the house and trying to bait someone to come out. Around 4 in the morning, completely exhausted, Sam and Mike finally drifted off. When Kurt came outside around 7 to wake them, he sounded strange, as Sam put it. When the two of them climbed out of the tent, they saw why. A section of the fence had been bent to the top, peeled outward, as if something had grabbed it and tried to pull it down. Not even a bear would have been tall or brave enough to do this. Needless to say, they packed up the tent and slept inside for the rest of the visit. August 10th, 2006. After the initial scare of the previous night had passed, and Kurt spent the day patrolling the woods around the house for several hundred yards in all directions with both Magic and DJ, he determined whatever had visited the night before was gone. That evening, Mike and I were invited to paintball with Kurt, Sam, and Rob for a few hours. Being hunters, the three of them were very good at this, and Mike and I both had minimal experience. I declined, preferring to stay on the balcony and do some target practice with my other cousin Claire, who was 2 years younger than me. The four of them disappeared into the woods, and soon all we heard was the popping of the paintball guns and the occasional shout of joy or pain whenever one of them pegged another. Now, I heard and saw nothing, but when Kelly cut the game short a couple hours later, when she called for Kurt to help her clean up after DJ threw up all over the carpet, Mike went directly up to me and told me something that chilled me to the bone. At one point in the game, he'd been trying to circle behind Rob to peg him a good one, and he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. Thinking it had been Sam or Kurt, Mike had crouched down in the bush as the thing approached. As it got closer, he decided it was Kurt, as the shape appeared to be very tall. Kurt is 6'4". He took aim. However, as it continued to approach him, Mike noticed it appeared to be wearing something shaggy, akin to a ghillie suit, and it took him a second to realize that none of them were wearing anything that resembled that. For those of you who don't know, ghillie suits are those shaggy camouflage uniforms soldiers wear to disguise themselves among bushes. Unnerved, Mike was debating on whether to shoot at it or not when he heard Kelly calling. As Sam, Rob, and Kurt began making their noisy way back towards the house, the shape disappeared back into the darkness. He didn't bring this up with the others until we sat down and talked about all of this, and it seriously freaked out Rob, Sam, and Kurt, since they hadn't seen or heard anything that night. August 11th, 2006. Kurt decided to take us fishing at, you guessed it, the same lake. He was not superstitious in the least, and neither were any of us, so despite the creepy encounters over the past couple days, we were willing to chalk it up to wild animals and Mike and me not being used to the woods. So the six of us hitched up the boat trailer, piled into Kurt's truck, and headed out. The lake was maybe a 20-minute drive from the highway, not including the time it took to meander from the house to the highway and highway to the lake. When we finally made it to the turnoff, Kurt drove very slowly as the rain from the past few weeks had made the path very treacherous and full of hidden bumps and ditches. Even going as slow as 10 miles an hour, the car bumped and jostled us enough to make our butts sore. Rob and Sam, ever the trackers, were leaning out of the side windows to try and spot any tracks in case they wanted to come back sometime later for hunting. They noted, but didn't mention until later, that all the tracks they saw seemed to be heading away from the lake. When we finally arrived, we split up. Rob, Sam, and Mike climbed in the smaller rowboat and headed off towards the other end of the lake. The lake itself was shaped like an uneven U, the main part being quite large, with the smaller part disappearing around a bend and ending at a natural beaver dam. All in all, it takes maybe a half an hour to row from one end to the other. While the boys were off doing their thing, Kurt, Claire, and me jumped into the slightly larger motorboat and hung around the main section of the lake. Fishing was relatively good, as between the three of us, over the course of several hours, we managed to catch 7 or 8 decent-sized fish. Nothing strange had happened up until the sun was just starting to set. We were casting our last few lines. At this time, I caught something truly massive on my line and attempted to reel it in with all I had. Being 12 at the time, I had very little arm strength, but I was determined to at least see what I'd caught. Kurt stepped in to help haul it up, thinking I'd either hooked a log or even a muskie, which is like a freshwater barracuda, quite strong and with nasty needle teeth. Google it if you want. Which were known to be in the lakes around the area. As a precaution in case this happened, all of our rods were strung with dragon line, made especially for fishing in musky territory, as it was strong enough that they wouldn't snap the line while struggling on the hook. With Kurt's help, I managed to haul whatever was hooked almost to the surface. The lake water was relatively murky, so visibility faded after the first foot or so, but even then, the three of us saw something very, very big rising to the surface. At this point, Kurt was convinced it was a muskie. as the line was jerking back and forth and a log wouldn't be able to do that. When the shape was maybe 4 feet from the surface, the line suddenly pulled so sharply, I nearly lost my grip on my pole. The top foot of the pole dipped into the water almost straight down as the thing dove, and then before the rod had a chance to break or be ripped from my hands, the line snapped. That's right, it snapped. The ricochet was almost enough to send me over the other side of the boat, but luckily, Claire was there to catch me. Unnerved, but not wanting to end the day just yet, Kurt trimmed the line and gave me a new setup. The next thing that happened was soon after, when Kurt hooked a particularly large bass on a 5-hook lure. While attempting to remove the hooks, the fish was flopping so much that one of the stray hanging hooks caught Kurt's thumb and gave it a pretty nasty slice. Luckily, he packed first aid supplies in the tackle box for accidents just like this. But when he dripped antiseptic on the cut, he held his hand over the side of the boat, letting the blood dribble into the water. After a few minutes, Claire pointed out a trail of bubbles and ripples on the surface of the water some yards out. It circled our boat slowly a couple times, but soon disappeared. As the sun was now setting enough that Kurt decided to call it a day, he motored us back to the shore and we hitched up the boat to the trailer. While Kurt packed the fishing rods and strung the fish on a line to keep them from flopping out of the truck bed, Claire and I went back down the shallows to look for frogs as we waited for the boys to return from the other side of the lake. Suddenly, we heard frantic shouting from the other side of the lake. Claire and I looked up to see the boys' boat quite literally skimming the water as they blew around the bend and gunning it straight for the shore. I remember thinking, since when did they have a motor on that boat? Because Rob was rowing so fast. Sam was shouting at us to get away from the water so they could land the boat, and moderately freaked out at their desperation. Claire and I promptly complied. In doing so, however, I tripped over an old campfire and ended up with a giant log pinning my foot down. Claire wasn't strong enough to lift the log, and by this time the boys' boat had reached the shore in record time. Now, my brother wasn't exactly the strong type either, being only 14. But as soon as the boat hit the sand, he leapt out and dragged it up the embankment single-handedly, with Rob and Sam still sitting in it. Once the boat was entirely out of the water, Sam jumped out and managed to lift the log clear off my foot, while Rob helped Mike and Kurt hitch up their boat. I've honestly never seen any of them more frantic and unnerved, and it scared me. Even Kurt, who didn't fully understand their panic, got the message enough to book it out from the lake. Normally calm and collected, he took the trail much too fast, and at several points we were afraid he'd break the hitch and we'd lose the boats. At this time, the sun had fully set behind the tree line, and it was unsettlingly dark inside the dense foliage. Rob kept turning to look behind us to make sure the boats were still hooked up, but it wasn't until later that I realized he was also keeping an eye out for anything else. The rest of us were looking forward, trying to spot the highway, so Rob was the only one to attest to this. But he swears, up and down, that right as the trail opened onto the highway shoulder and we exited the woods, he saw a huge and hairy arm swing out towards the boat, as if trying to grab the fish we'd left in the bottom with the tackle gear. He said it was thick and heavy like a bear's arm, but the elbow was all wrong, and it was much too long and high off the ground. He didn't mention this to any of us until several days later when Mike and I were packing up to head back home. When questioned later, as we were preparing the fish for dinner, Sam explained that they'd been exploring the lake for a while, and at the very end of the inlet was a huge beaver dam that had been there for quite some time, and they wanted to show Mike what it looked like. When they arrived, however, the dam was demolished. It looked like something very large and very strong had decided to use the logs as scratching posts. Weirded out, they decided not to get any closer and headed back towards the bend before dropping anchor. As the sun began to set and they were finishing up with their last few catches, Mike had hooked a bass right in the eye. It bled all the way up to the surface and all over the boat as they took the hook out. They washed the blood out as best as they could and prepared to pack up when they noticed the same bubbles and ripple trail Claire and I had seen heading straight for them. Now, seriously freaked, Rob had grabbed the oars without another word and booked it back to shore. Between that day and the day we left, the three of them had slowly told Mike and me the previous incidents and encounters. But at this point, I had been sure that they were just trying to freak us out as a going-away present. Kurt finished off our trip by telling us a local urban legend, one he had convinced we'd encountered for real. Keep in mind, what I'm writing here is from memory and what Kurt told us, so if there are any inaccuracies with geography or historical evidence, that's on him. In his words, the story begins over 200 years ago. A wagon full of settlers headed west got lost and turned around in the winter snowstorms. Instead of following their path, the settlers ended up going north. They came upon a small lake in the middle of northern Wisconsin and decided to make camp there, hoping to ride out the rest of the winter storms rather than risking continuing and getting more lost. They didn't make it, and their story was forgotten for a century before prospective hunters and fishermen came upon the lake, hoping for a good place to stake out for the season. After exploring and doing some digging into what appeared to be an old abandoned campsite, they found the remains. The majority of what they found were animal bones, oxen and horses and other livestock that the settlers would have had with them. However, out of the 150 people estimated to have been part of the wagon train, only about 20-something remains were found. Theories abounded about what could have happened. Some speculated the settlers suffered a similar fate to the Donner Party, forced into cannibalism to survive the brutal winter before moving on once the snow abated. Others wanted to blame a hostile Native American tribe for slaughtering the settlers and taking the bodies back to their lands, but no evidence of this was found either. The local tribe, the Ojibwe, keep in mind these are Kurt's words, so I have no accurate how this may be, offered another scenario. They told of a terrible creature, half man and half bear, that stood over 10 feet tall and could swim underwater for hours at a time. It can scent blood from miles away and is incredibly territorial. The tribes had stories about how they sent their strongest and bravest warriors to kill the creature, but none of them ever returned. Most of the older tribesmen refused to speak of it or even name it. The creature's territory is apparently centered around the lake and radiates for several miles in all directions. The disappearance of the wagon train in the 1800s was the first instance of a large-scale attack. The slaughter of the Ojibwe warriors was the second. Essentially, it's a local native version of Bigfoot, except moderately more terrifying. The natives had a name for it, and I'm probably butchering the spelling, but I tried spelling it out phonetically since I've never seen it written anywhere, and unfortunately this seems to be a small enough legend that Google is no help. They called it the Ashwannabe Mukwa. Mike and I laughed it off, and all of us parted in good spirits. Still not convinced of anything, but a little wary, if only subconsciously. August 16th, 2006. Kurt and Rob were hunting in the woods, shortly after we'd left, and happened upon something truly terrifying. They emailed us the next day with the story, and this time, pictures. Now, the email began. Bears usually mark their territory by clawing trees at the edges of their territory, leaving distinctive markings. However, these markings are rarely seen higher than 6 or 7 feet from the ground. The mark Kurt found? 10 feet off the ground. Remember, he's 6'4". This was the only marking they found in the area, but decided against searching for too long. Clearly, whatever had made a marking that high off the ground was incredibly big and tall, and neither of them were willing to risk running into it. They'd only been in the area for about an hour or so, having driven in and parked their car on a dirt road before heading off to hunt. While they returned to the car, they saw something that scared them so much that, to this day, they have not returned to that hunting spot. Over the tracks of their tire were two humongous footprints. One of the photos shows Kurt's foot next to the print for a size comparison, and it's important to note that he was a size 12. Even more disturbing was that to achieve that stride, the thing had to be at least 9 feet tall and walking on 2 legs, something a bear is not capable of. The depth of the holes the claws left behind was enough to scare the daylights out of them. I'm still a skeptic about urban legends and otherworldly, supernatural occurrences, but I know my cousins well enough to know that they would never fake something like this. So, either someone is playing a very elaborate hoax on them, or there's indeed something out there. I'm not saying one or the other. June 2007. A couple outside of Lac du Flambeau, outside the supposed creature's usual roaming area, reported of vandalism to local authorities. What baffled the couple and confused the police was their story. Over the course of several days, the couple had attempted to set up elaborate bird feeders, hoping to attract birds to photograph. They set up the birdhouse, left for the day for work, and returned in the evening to find the birdhouse demolished. Thinking they hadn't set it up correctly, they bought a new one and set it out the next morning. Rinse and repeat for over a week. Finally, fed up with whatever could be doing it, they suspected vandalism and decided to stay home one day, hoping to catch the culprit in the act. They set up one last bird feeder, spent the day lounging around the house, but nothing happened. Finally, as dusk settled and they prepared dinner, the husband heard a noise coming from the backyard. Grabbing flashlights, the two of them ran outside to confront whoever it was destroying the birdhouse. What they described was what confused the police. Both the husband and the wife claimed to see what resembled a bear standing on 2 legs, ripping the birdhouse apart with its front paws. When they turned on their flashlights and directed the beams at the creature, it turned and lumbered away, still on 2 legs, before disappearing into the woods. Things to keep in mind. Bear paws don't have the dexterity to pick up and rip apart a birdhouse, and they certainly can't actually run away on 2. At most, they can only take a few steps before dropping back to all 4s, as their legs are too stumpy to allow them to reach a substantial speed. It didn't gallop in the way bears usually move. The couple described its movements as a lumbering walk, more akin to the way a monkey walks on 2 legs. Police investigated the area with canines, but were unable to turn up anything. The couple didn't report any further vandalism. July 2007. We were visiting the cousins again. Nothing much happened over the 2 weeks we were there except for one instance. Sam and Mike were walking down to a lake, more like an overly large pond, near the house one afternoon when they heard what sounded like a bear moving through the foliage to their side. The 2 of them were on the dirt road, so they turned to see if they could make out whatever it was making the noise. They both claimed to have seen something tall, large, and incredibly shaggy in the distance lumbering off into the shadows. Needless to say, they turned around and came straight back to the house. Nothing else happened that year. July 2008. The whole family, sans Kurt, was visiting us in California for 2 weeks. Kurt stayed home because he couldn't get any time off from his job. He'd been home alone before, with just Magic and DJ for company. And being both a police officer and a seasoned hunter, he was not scared of being alone. However, one day, he calls us to talk about an incident that occurred the night before. When he spoke, his voice actually shook a bit. I don't think he cried or anything, but he was certainly shaken. Apparently, around 11 at night, right as Kurt was about to go to bed, DJ and Magic started barking like crazy, staring out the side window towards the backyard with their tails up and their hair raised. Normally, they only get like that when they scent bears or other predators while hunting, and are otherwise very calm and quiet. When Kurt approached the sliding doors to try and see what could have been making them so agitated, they felt quiet, except for whining very quietly, their tails tucked tightly between their legs. Kurt told us he had heard what sounded to be something incredibly large moving around, right outside the fence. But the house had no exterior lights that pointed in the direction, so he couldn't see anything. The dogs refused to budge from their position, so he moved to close the curtains just in case something moved into their sight, and set them off again. Right as he did so, he said he heard a noise he could only describe as horrific. A deep, brassy growl with a screech overlaying it. Just like Rob had heard so many years ago, that night he'd snuck out. This time, however, it sounded as if the creature was just outside the fence, hidden by the shadows. Kurt proceeded to lock every single window and door, switch on every light in the house, and then take both dogs into the master bedroom, the only room in the house with no windows, and lock the door, staying there until morning. Luckily, nothing else happened that summer. It's been many years since this, and unfortunately I have not kept in close contact with my cousins. Rob moved out sometime around 2011, when he enrolled in college and hasn't been home since. Sam joined the Marines in 2012 and hasn't been home either. Claire hasn't been in contact with me, and Aunt Kelly had a sort of falling out with my mom, so they haven't been speaking either. I don't know if anything else has happened over these past few years, and this little local legend seems to be low-key enough that Googling anything about it doesn't yield many results. So again, I'm not a believer in aliens or Bigfoot or ghosts or anything else. Really. I don't want to say I'm a skeptic. I like to keep an open mind, but I haven't seen much to give me definitive proof either. These encounters have been the closest I've come to anything of the sort, and I'm still not quite sure what to think. I'm just glad to have written all this down somewhere. 2 weeks ago, I considered myself a reasonably skeptic man. I was convinced that somewhere in the vastness of this realm, another intelligent life form inhabited an Earth-like planet. Whether or not said beings have visited us was up for debate. Even though I had never personally experienced anything that could be considered paranormal, I had heard enough stories to leave open the possibility. On the contrary, the notion of the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, Yeti, Mothman, and other crypto things alike was laughable. As I lay in this hospital bed, crippled, in pain, and in fear, my view on monsters has drastically changed. I worked night shift security for a company that had been experiencing significant vandalism. Graffiti, broken windows, litter, the types of things bored kids find fun to do. The building is located on the outskirts of a small suburban area. The backside, shop area of the property faces a set of train tracks, a little traveled highway, and a vast forest beyond the road. The front was offices where I spent most of my time. My duties basically involved watching TV and playing video games while keeping an ear out for any mischief outside. Once every hour I would take a stroll around the perimeter of the building. The first few months were the most eventful. It was rare that a night would pass and I didn't have to chase some kids off. A few times these encounters got a bit dicey. I'm not a gun person, so this led to me bringing my German Shepherd pup, Shoe, to work with me. He's named after Michael Schumacher. Once the hoodlums realized that my dog didn't like strangers, they stopped coming around. The job became a breeze for a while, and then some strange things started happening. It all started 3 Thursdays ago. It was raining that particular night. I don't make the rounds as much when it rains, as I figure nobody really cares to be out in that crap. I was working a typical 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift, and the 2 previous perimeter checks were uneventful. I donned my rain gear and headed out for a 4 a.m. check. As soon as I stepped outside, I was greeted by a horrific odor. A combination of feces, wet dog, and a dumpster on a 100-degree day stung my nostrils. I don't know if it was a smell or what, but Shu was hesitant to leave my side. Unusual behavior for him. So we made our way around the building, the smell still piercing our noses. My flashlight picked up the reflection of something in the grass. It was a blood trail. Shu led the way along the path. Ultimately, we discovered a deer carcass. It was absolutely torn to shreds, blood and guts everywhere. Both of its hind legs were missing. Once morning came around and the evidence was brought to the building's owner's attention, we both agreed it was most likely some type of prank. We buried the remains in a hole in a far corner of the property. The next night was clear, but crisp. My rounds occurred more frequently. Everything was normal until around 2 a.m. It was somewhere around 1/4 to 2:30 when Shu started freaking out. He was barking incessantly, and I couldn't calm him down. I walked into the shop area and immediately heard what sounded like heavy footsteps coming from the roof of the building. A brief check around the building revealed no ladders or any other means of accessing the roof. The smell from the day before was lingering, although nowhere near as pungent. Besides my personal account, no other evidence was able to be reported to the owners. Saturday night was uneventful. Sunday evening would change my life forever, though. After a fairly anxious but boring 3 hours, I hear a window break. Shu is scratching at the door before I can even get to it. It sounded like a back of the building occurrence, so we quickly made our way back there. Everything appeared normal. No kids, no pranksters, nothing. Then Shu took off in a dead sprint. He ran straight towards a small grove of trees separating the property from the train tracks. As I yelled for him to come back, he froze in his tracks about 10 feet from a cluster of 4 or 5 trees. A large, muscular arm reached out and encased his head in its palm. A quick jerk of the wrist, and Shu's neck snapped like a twig. Horrified by the sight, I let out an audible gasp. Whatever this beast was, it immediately focused its attention in my direction. There are 3 entrance points to this building. The nearest 2 are locked. The only unlocked entrance point would require me to run between this monster and the door. Since it was dark, I figured I could make it. I started sprinting. I made it about 25 to 35 yards before I felt a tug in the back of my shirt. The strength of the grip rendered me unable to escape. I fell to the ground. My heavy breathing only served to drown out the thunderous beating of my heart. I managed to gather my bearings only to realize I was being mounted by something. I suppose it took my mind a while to comprehend what my eyes were viewing. I was being pinned to the ground by an ape. An ape covered head to toe with matted red to brownish fur. A human face with a primate body had pinned me to the earth. This creature's eyes glowed a vibrant red. We locked eyes, and it was at this point I came to a conclusion: this beast was about to take my life. I vaguely remember trying to kick and punch my way out of this thing's control. My attempted recourse proved futile. My last memory is a bit clouded, but I can clearly recall looking this thing eye to eye and feeling a certainty of death. The giant beast picked me up and hurled my defenseless body against a tree 20 to 28 feet up. The tree snapped it in half. My helpless body served as an unsuccessful saw. I assume a Sasquatch is what broke my back and has left me confined to this hospital bed. My vertebrae lost its battle against said lumber. Bigfoot is real. Bigfoot kicked my ass. I'll never forget that smell. I'll never forget my eye contact with a creature spawned straight from the depths of hell. I miss Shu, and I miss my innocence. A lot of people are going to view this as creative writing. It isn't. For many people that have traumatic experiences, there is plenty of outlets and support groups. Not for me. Everyone calls me a crackpot on the first few occasions I get drunk enough to talk about what happened. I don't appreciate that. This is a real story and a real event that's caused a lot of turmoil in my small family at the time. When I was 12 years old, me, my dad, and my mom lived and managed a large deer lease in Arkansas near the town of Mena. My dad and I were skilled outdoorsmen and made a good chunk of change hunting pigs on horseback. At the time, their population had grown out of control, and they were viewed as pests. Not only did you not need tags to hunt them, but you could get paid up to $50 a head basis. The meat is great for sausage, too. So it came as a surprise to my father and I when the pigs around our property suddenly began to vanish. At first, we thought it was our neighbor 20 miles west, strong-arming our profit with his sons as he had before. But after my father went to his ranch to confront him about the issue, he came back ashen-faced and wouldn't tell me or my mother what had been discussed. All he said was, Bill wasn't the reason for the shortage of pigs, and that me and my brother and mother were to stay in the house. Of course, being the young, curious person I was, I woke up before my dad, saddled my horse, and went to the woods. I rode the perimeter of our property, and as before, I didn't find a single pig. But I did find something else. About noon, I came to a large clearing in the forest, and clear as day, where I first thought was a child stepped out in front of my horse and I quickly realized that this was no normal child, as it stood staring at me. I noticed that, although it had a very human-like face, with what I can only describe as slightly mongoloid features, it was covered in black, dark brown fur. We just stared intently at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then, I heard something huge crashing through the forest in our direction. Without the slightest command from me, my horse bolted in the opposite direction. I could hear it hot on our heels, snarling and screaming. Eventually, we got some ground on whatever it was when we hit open meadow, and then abandoned the chase. When I got home, my dad wasn't furious at me as I had expected. He could tell something had happened, and after I explained what I'd seen, he hugged me and said the experience was punishment enough and that I wasn't to go in the woods without him ever again. I wasn't at all opposed to this. That being said, this was far from over. About a week later, we were sitting at the table enjoying my mom's Gordon Ramsay-esque jambalaya when the phone rang. My dad excused himself from the table and went to answer it. He came back to the dining room and told me, "Get your boots on and go grab your saddle. Something happened at Bill's place." Without question, I obeyed, and despite protests from my mother and demands for an explanation, we were soon going full gallop towards Bill's ranch. We didn't particularly like Bill or his boys very much, but in the Ozark Appalachian areas, we have sort of an unspoken law that if your neighbor needs help, you are to oblige them. When we got there, the situation was complete chaos. Bill's wife, Maggie, was knelt on the porch sobbing her eyes out, and Bill and his 2 sons were scurrying about, loading firearms and filling backpacks full of provisions. My dad dismounted and ran up to Bill and asked him what was going on. My youngest was taken by someone. Maggie saw it. She said he was out feeding the pigs and someone came out from behind the shed and grabbed him. What did the person look like? Bill gave my dad a frightened look and said, "You know damn well what it looked like. It isn't a person." My dad gulped and told me to go help Bill's boys get ready. We were going hunting. After Bill called the sheriff, they got on their 4-wheelers and followed us into the forest. The 5 of us got about 15 miles in the woods before we saw the first one. It had likely been following us since Bill's ranch, and I only got a small glimpse of it before it snatched Bill's oldest son, Grant, off his 4-wheeler and ran off. It was big. This thing was easily 8 feet tall, and it moved like an Olympic sprinter. We chased it for another 200 feet before it dropped Grant. He was in a state of shock, but alive. Bill took Grant and his other son back home, but my dad and I decided to pursue this thing. We chased it for miles, but soon it hit deep ravines that were unpassable for even our horses. We shot at it. My dad claimed he hit it several times. If he did, the thing didn't slow down a bit. We rode back home around 1 in the morning. After checking on Bill's family and writing out port for the deputy had finally shown up. Even after we made a huge stink about the issue, the sheriff's office didn't do anything about the problem. To my knowledge, Bill's youngest son, Tommy, was never found. Your official statement was, it was a gang of homeless people that had taken up residence in the forest, and we were, quote, try and avoid them. Yeah, right. Nobody bought it. About 2 weeks later, they attacked our house. I was watching NCIS with my dad at about 9 p.m. when we heard the first, what we thought was heavy hail. Our house at the time was a metal building, and if you ever had lived in one, you know how things tend to echo. My dad went to the window and quickly reeled back. He bellowed at me to grab my rifle. We both looked out the window, and to my horror we saw about 8 of the huge things hurling rocks at our house. We stuck our rifles out the window and shot at them, and when we did, they would hit the tree line temporarily, but they would be back 10, 20 minutes later. It was about 2 a.m. when we heard hard banging on our door, and we knew they were trying to come in. Luckily for us, near the kitchen, my dad had dug and constructed a tornado shelter from the previous year. If you're familiar with Arkansas, you know it's smack dab in the middle of Tornado Alley, and we regularly get devastating F4s and F5s. We knew the door wasn't going to hold, so we piled into the small cellar, and my dad deadbolted the heavy steel door. They did indeed get in. All night we listened to them wrecking our house. All night me and my family sat completely silent. All of us, including my mom, gripping guns tighter than a vice grip. We were praying they didn't find us. They gave up and left around 10 a.m. When we emerged from the cellar, our house was nearly demolished. Things were strewn everywhere. The TV had been hurled against the wall, made a huge dent. My dad's air compressor had been crushed like a tin can. Understandably, we packed up the truck, put the horses in a trailer, and made a beeline for my grandparents' house in Dallas. We were never the same after that. We had to sell our beloved horses. I had to make the hard transition to city life, where kids made fun of my accent and would just bully the crap out of me all the way up until high school. Luckily, I overcame it all, and I'm about to get my master's next year. I'm also happily married and expecting a daughter soon. Those creatures not only wrecked our house, but they also wrecked my childhood. To this day, I'm a dedicated Bigfoot researcher, and I've worked with all the big names, including Fraud Standing and a man I very much admire named David Paulsides. I know there are some squatchers out there who are trying to preserve and protect Bigfoot, but I always carry a firearm when I'm out in the woods, and if I ever see another one, I'm blowing its hairy head off.